There's a ton of noise out there. So how do you get decision makers to pay attention to your brand? Start a podcast and invite your ideal clients to be guests on your show. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Welcome back to B2B Growth. I am your host for today's episode, Nikki Ivy with Sweetfish Media. Guys, I've got with me today Paul Ironside, who is founder and CEO of CommercialTribe. Paul, how are you doing today?
Nikki, I'm fine, thanks. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, I'm super excited. So the topic that we're going to be discussing today is one very close to my heart. Like you and I discussed offline, having spent some time out here in these startup streets. I'm very acquainted with, I've seen up close the importance of coaching and having a culture of coaching, but you were going to give us the who, where, what, and how of coaching frontline sales management. But before we get into all of that, Paul, I would love it if you would just give us a little bit of background on yourself and what you and the folks at CommercialTribe have been up to these days.
Yeah, sure. So Nikki, again, thanks for the time consideration here this afternoon, but you are definitely talking to a sales manager. So yes, the title, the bottom of my card says CEO and founder of CommercialTribe, which is a software company. I was absolutely born in the function of sales at a company called Gartner as an individual contributor turned sales manager. So kind of like many sales managers, we start off in this individual role, we perform, we get elevated into these managerial roles and kind of ta-da, off we go. So I was there for about 8 years. I left and went to an organization based in Washington, D.C. called the Corporate Executive Board, or CEB. And for many of your listeners that have actually read and followed the Challenger sale, it is home to the Challenger sale. But I was there for almost a decade. Last 3 years, I ran the sales organization. I was a direct report to the chairman and CEO, one of kind of 10 executive team members running the organization, roughly $500 million in total top line sales, publicly traded company. Nikki, that's a long-winded way of saying at the end of the day, you are definitely talking to a sales manager. So hopefully in 60 seconds or less, that's me in a nutshell.
I love it. Those are my fave because they've been the folks, for better or for worse, who have had the biggest impact on what I learned as an individual contributor on a sales floor. Now, whether that was as an SDR in my first, SaaS startup role, or as an AE, who was maybe in that role because I thought that that's the next thing you do after you're an SDR and you're supposed to do this well or whatever. But these are the folks who I was able to learn sort of through their mistakes, unfortunately, and through their hard more often than not, and then a lot through their grit. So they tend to be on some heroes of really any organization, but certainly of the sales organization. So I'm happy to get this information. Tell me, before we get into the actual, who, what, where, and how of this thing, talk to me a little bit more about why you think this is important, why so many folks get it wrong.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think as sales leaders and leaders inside organizations, we continue to make the mistake of believing that the individual contributor's skill set actually translates into an effective manager. And when you talk about it, you got to step back and think about it. Everything associated with the individual, it is an individual territory. It's an individual goal. It's an individual comp plan, individual on day one. And then we elevate them into a team role, a managerial role. And while there's certainly similarities in terms of, you're selling, the nature of the roles arguably couldn't be more different. And we don't really provide those managers a framework to be successful in the role. Rather, what we do is we hope and we pray, we cross our fingers to say, hey, everything that you were doing to become a rock star individual seller, we hope translates over into kind of rubbing off on your sales executives.
You got the right stuff, right? You can do it. Just push yourself. So when that doesn't work out, and I was talking to a woman on this show a few episodes back about some examples that we see in sports, right? And other areas of life where we've seen this not pan out, right? You take a star, a Hall of Fame, a once in a lifetime talent, right? In a sporting environment, in a sporting context, and try and say, hey, let's let that person be a coach or GM of a team. Let's talk about how many times that's worked out. Not very often. So we've seen this not work out. And why is what you're just telling us, right? Because we keep making this same mistake. So where do we begin, right? In the who, what, when, where, and how, when you're trying to right this ship, where should we first focus our attention in trying to coach up new sales management?
Sure. The very first place it's got to start is actually at the top. You've got to have senior sales leaders. So chief revenue officer, chief sales officer, that he or she has got to make a declaration that they want to solve this problem. If in fact they're not aligned around some type of sales management efficacy program, it will not get underway inside an organization. So kind of thing number one. And then thing number two, like everything that we do, it needs a framework. So if you think about frameworks, we use frameworks when, to use your sports metaphor, there's an offensive playbook that governs the way that an offense in football is going to march down the field. Same way there's a defensive schema. Those are frameworks. Well, in selling, we use sales methodologies as a way in which to understand where you are in the sales process. Well, it's not too dissimilar with regards to sales management. What type of a sales management framework that help to govern certain managerial events, such as the pipeline review, the forecast review, the one-on-one, the what we call joint traveling or call partnering, when your manager is partnering with their individual team members on live sales interactions. So those types of frameworks are where we begin to lean in to try and provide organizations help and assistance with regards to improving the efficacy of their managers.
What I'm curious about, what I really want to hear your input on here is when that should start, right? So you've just told us what the first focus should be, but it kind of feels like once a person's already been promoted into that role and they're already, presented with these goals and this quota and these things in, this pressure to succeed, or else, somebody's coming for your seat. At what point do we start coaching folks up into this role and spending that time with them?
Yeah, sure. So in our opinion, you can't start early enough. And most organizations, no one's going to say, no, I don't want to invest in my sales managers to create kind of this force multiplier effect. Nobody says no to that. Mm-hmm. The question is what type of resource will they put behind it? And most of the organizations, these kind of larger, more mature organizations tend to be our customers. And they are implementing at some degree some type of an efficacy program. And where I'm going to answer your question is whether you have a program or you're looking to implement a program, my advice is start to invest in those individuals that can have a greater impact on your individual contributors and your team members, the force multipliers, sales managers. And what will happen is you'll start to identify those as individual contributors that truly have the interest to become a sales manager. And as they're coming into the role, we can start to shape, mold, curate, if you will, the next generation of leaders inside the organization.
Right. Because it's like, look, a lot of the KPIs like you and I talked about offline and at the top of this conversation that get folks into these roles are individual contributor KPIs, right? So that's all we've measured up until the point that they get the role. So I'm wondering, it sounds like you said that's built into these efficacy programs, is how to define what these other KPIs are to get a better fit into those roles outside of, were they rock stars? Right?
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. And so we have come up with a number of different indices to try and measure the performance of a sales manager. The easy ones that we go to is just percent to plan. Did you or did you not hit your number? And amen, we're all accustomed to that. And it's right. I mean, we're in this job to engineer to goal. But just looking at a manager's ability to hit their team goal is not the most accurate indication on whether or not they're an effective manager. And my point being is more often than not, on that team, they have 2 or 3 rock stars that are carrying the weight of the entire team. In other words, you've got 2 or 3 that are 150, 200% of plan, and you've got 4 or 5 that are at 15% of plan. And that's what we see. And so the better metric, and not the end all be metric, but a simple metric to look at efficacy of sales managers are percent of reps that make plan per manager.
Right. No, that's it. That's definitely it. And so once you get to the right person in the role, you've figured out how to look for that early on and where to begin. Talk about the next dimension of where they need to focus on. What do we start with? We started with the what?
So we can start with the frameworks, the frameworks themselves, right? So once they actually said, yes, we're actually going to implement an efficacy program, there are these different dimensions of a frontline sales manager job. We ask them to do pipeline reviews, forecast reviews, one-on-ones, go out into the field and either joint travel with them in terms of one-on-one live sales calls with the reps or get on the telephone with them. Mm-hmm. Our recommendation is start with the observation, start with the live sales call or the call partnering. And we build frameworks to allow managers to assess the efficacy of their individual contributors conducting those calls. Let me give you a sports metaphor example. In other words, there's a lot of things that happen. I'm going to use a golf metaphor, so just bear with me here for a minute. But if in fact you're a golfing coach, you could watch and observe your golfer on many different dimensions, coming off the tee, in the middle of the fairway, in and around the greens, chipping and putting. What we suggest is actually observe your sales executives on sales calls, and we give them a framework for what to look for when they are teeing off. What are the 4 or 5 basic behaviors that they need to be looking for on whether or not their sales executive is actually modeling the right characteristics to advance the sales cycle from stage 1 to stage 2?
Right. Beyond just like, did they book the demo or, you know what I'm saying? Right. Beyond those things.
You're exactly right. And so some of those behaviors, as an example, are things such as, did the individual contributor seller set an effective intro and agenda? Did they tell a compelling story? Did they identify a key issue that's worth solving? Did they align a relevant use case? Did they qualify close next steps? Those are 5 basic generic behaviors that if a sales manager was going out on a sales call to watch an early stage, what we call sometimes the discovery meeting, kind of stage 1, if they execute to a high standard, the individual contributor on those behaviors, they have a much higher probability of advancing the meeting. If I said it differently real quick, if the seller didn't set an agenda, in other words, they just started talking.
Right.
If they weren't compelling, they just said, yeah, my company, it's all right, it does A, B, and C. If they didn't get to an issue that your prospect cared about, you can now begin to see that this sales cycle wouldn't advance.
Right. I love this idea of, did they tell a compelling story? I think a lot of the time, it turns out being more like, did they effectively deliver the script? Most of the folks that I worked with in these startup streets were pro script. I happen to be pro script myself, actually.
I'm pro script too.
I'm pro script. Because I think you need a framework.
I think
you need a map. You need to know where you're going. Because the less thinking you have to do while you're talking, the more you can actually be listening while the other person is talking. So I get it. But when we get to wrapped up in the script itself, we as salespeople, not the leadership. I think the leadership typically gets it. They understand it's a tool.
Yeah.
But when new salespeople get too wrapped up in the script itself and how, whether or not they sound like the person next to them that's delivering it, the less they understand that really the heart of it is, are you telling a compelling story? So they go from, most of us, if you go on an interview to be an account executive, right? you've had to do a mock call or a mock discovery, whatever, a mock cold call in a lot of cases. And those elements, they're asking for it in that situation, right? That the leadership is looking for there, because there is no script at that point. They haven't taught you it yet. So all they can look at is your natural ability or your learned skillful ability, whichever you believe is the case, whichever of those that you demonstrate when you're telling a compelling story. But then they don't often go back to that. What takes over for that is then how well the person has learned the script versus am I coaching them on telling a compelling story. So I love that element of it. I don't know if we're actually giving people the who, what, where, when, and why in the very neat way that I'd planned to tee you up to do before we got on this call.
You got it. I mean,
I nerd out on this stuff. I love this stuff.
You directionally have it. And what we're after there is the how. So no doubt about it, we can help you understand who to coach, what to coach, where to coach. And then these frameworks that we provide also give you some orientation around how to do it. And so It's not binary. Did you or did you not tell a story? It's to the degree in which you were effective. And so within the framework that we provide, we give you a pretty simple guideline that says, hey, if in fact you're not modeling storytelling to a high standard, it's going to look and sound like this, versus you are modeling it to a high standard, it's going to look and sound like that. Mm-hmm. And it's maybe I'm not explaining it all that well, but hopefully you could begin to see it's a 5-point Likert scale, if I can use that term. Analytic rubric, but I don't want to confuse our listeners because it's not important. But there's a bunch of IP behind, how we come in and design these things to make sure that they're in the workflow of a sales manager, that they're not struggling with trying to understand what these behaviors are or what the scale looks like. No. It's in their workflow. It's in their vocabulary. It's what's most important.
Yes, we're putting names to these things. We're defining these things because a lot of the time, like when you're talking about, did you tell a compelling story to this degree? That has to have a rubric. Otherwise, it is so subjective that it will leave both the student and the teacher, right, completely frustrated, sometimes even just defeated. I'm going to be raw with you right now. I've had to exit organizations, not of my own will, because we got to a point where it sounded like what was being asked of me was to demonstrate something. And I thought I was demonstrating it, but there wasn't a rubric for how I should demonstrate it.
To what standard you were demonstrating.
To what standard. And then how is that weighted up against the other things, right? So let's just say I'm not saying I got a gift, but I might have a gift. Let's just say I have a gift for telling a compelling story. So let's say if I have that gift and I'm executing that to this degree, and then there's some other metric like just did you book the meeting? If all we're looking at is did you book the meeting, and we're not figuring out why someone who's telling such compelling stories is not booking meetings, simply you don't book the meeting, goodbye. I think that, again, is how you have folks that might have, if they were able to stick with it, end up being good sales leaders, good sales managers, leaving the profession altogether. I mean, they didn't run me out, but some folks get run out of the profession altogether because of this one trick thing.
You're on it. But let me shape that just a little bit. So the result, the objective that we're engineering to is to get the meeting. We're trying to book the meeting.
Sure, of course. Yep.
And one of the key characteristics to booking that meeting, one of the key behaviors, if you will, is telling a compelling story. But it's not the only one.
Sure.
Right? There are others. I mean, time management is another means and mechanism by which to do that. Effective questioning might be another means of doing that. Managing an objection. These are all different skills, competencies, and behaviors that go into booking the meeting. And so while, to your point, you may be, spike on your ability to tell a story, and I can tell that, there's no doubt about that. But in terms of your ability to manage time or ask effective questions and these other characteristics or behaviors, that's what we look at. That's what we look at to try and figure out what are the behaviors that drive performance.
Right. And I think that's where this coaching the coaches is so important, because if I'm new to the organization and the person who is a sales manager who is coaching me is new to that role, right, say a year or less in that role, then it's easier for both of us to identify, yes, this person, like you said, spikes on storytelling. It's a lot more difficult to identify, again, how they should weight that up against the other things, right? And to coach me around. If I've never been coached around time management, You hit it on the head. Are you reading my diary? Are you in my head?
No, I'm just looking at how much time we have left.
Oh, he pulled my card. It's true, y'all. But anyway, so if I had never been coached around that, and this guy had never been coached around how to coach around that, well, then that's how we get to both of us throwing our hands up and being like, thanks, I'm sorry, I can't help you. You can't help me, but it was fun. So yeah, it's so important and so valuable. And I think I think any team really needs this. We're talking in the context of sales and sales managers and frontline leadership, but anytime you've got like new leaders who are not at the executive or C-suite level of teams, they're going to have to be taught how to do that job in its own right, which is obviously at the crux of what we're talking about. But since you pointed out my lack of time management skills, it is the truth that we have spent all of our time fleshing this out for you guys. And I'm so glad we did, because you really did lay this out in a way that I think is really easy to consume and easy to understand sort of the impact of doing this right and doing this wrong. But now that I've successfully picked your brain and seen what I could get out of it, it is time, Paul, for you to tell us what you are putting in it. So talk about a learning resource that you have engaged with here recently that is either, informing your approach that's just got you excited these days.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. Probably the one thing that's really blowing my hair back right now is an effort that was launched by a friend of mine. His name is Matt Larson. He's a super successful entrepreneur here in Colorado that is now turning his attention to more kind of philanthropic work. And he's just launched something called the Human Improvement Project. And I cannot stress enough, the Human Improvement Project, the acronym is a cool one, HIP, the Human Improvement Project. Go check it out. And I think for all parents that are out there really trying to understand how to better communicate with their children and really get on the same level and understand the emotional development of our kids and the role that parents play. No doubt about it, it has broad implications into corporate environments and other relationships that you have. But the way in which we impact and imprint on our children and the emotional volatility that they're in today and how we shape that, that's what they're doing. And it's just great stuff. And I couldn't be more supportive and enthusiastic about the work that Matt and his team are doing.
I love it. This is the kind of recommendation I live for on this show. You are reading my diary because I'm a mother of 2 teen girls, and I'm going to go right out and check this out. So like me, I know that everybody listening has become a fast fan of yours, Paul. Tell us how to connect with you.
So I think it's relatively simple. CommercialTribe.com. I'm on LinkedIn. I've got a Twitter handle. I think just those kind of basic, you should be able to find me. If you can't find me, that's a problem. But I don't.
Fair enough. I won't ask you for the Twitter handle. Y'all, he gave us homework. You got to, if you want him on Twitter, you got to, and you got to practice your research tools, right? I want to have you on again because there are things that you and I talked about offline that we didn't get to because of my poor time management skills. And y'all, the listeners shouldn't suffer for it. So we'll have you on again. This has been really fun. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about how important it really is to put a premium on coaching the coaches. Thanks so much, Paul.
Nikki, you're awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
We totally get it. We publish a ton of content on this podcast, and it can be a lot to keep up with. That's why we've started the B2B Growth Big 3, a no-fluff email that boils down our 3 biggest takeaways from an entire week of episodes. Sign up today at sweetfishmedia.com/big3. That's sweetfishmedia.com/big3.